my brother said. You're the black sheep, always will be. And everyone laughed. I smiled and said, good luck without me. 3 days later they regretted everything when It was supposed to be just another family gathering, loud, chaotic, predictable. We were all packed into my parents' backyard, the familiar smell of overcooked burgers and burned corn on the cob floating in the air. Kids ran around shrieking, old folks drank cheap beer, and my brother David, the golden boy himself, held court at the patio table, laughing that big, hollow laugh everyone seemed to adore. I knew better. I always had. David raised his beer and, without even a glance in my direction, shouted, to family! Even the black sheep! His eyes finally found mine, a sly grin spreading across his face. You're the black sheep, Ethan. Always will be! The laughter that followed was loud and easy. Too easy. Even my sister Jenna, who I'd once bailed out of a nasty legal mess, was laughing like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all day. My mother covered her mouth with a half-hearted, "Oh, David," but I saw the pride glint in her eyes. I smiled. Not forced. Not bitter. Calm. Like a man who's already packed his bags and cancelled his forwarding address. Good luck without me, I said simply, my voice cutting through the laughter like a knife through silk. Then I stood up, brushed imaginary dust off my jeans, and walked away. No yelling. No slammed doors. Just a clean, final exit. They didn't know it yet, but the foundations under their perfect little world had just been pulled out. And the cracks would start showing a lot sooner than they thought. The first crack came less than 48 hours later. I was sitting at my kitchen table, a cup of strong coffee in one hand, my phone buzzing relentlessly in the other. I let it buzz. I knew who it was without even checking the screen, Dad. He never called unless something was wrong. I finally answered on the fourth call, leaning back in my chair, staring out at the gray afternoon sky. Hey, Dad, I said like nothing at all had changed. His voice came out tight, strained. Ethan, did you talk to Martin over at Apex Holdings? I smiled a little. No, Dad. I haven't spoken to Martin since Friday. Silence. Heavy. Nervous. Dad cleared his throat. Well, he just pulled out of the land deal. No explanation. Just out. I nodded to myself. Martin was an old college friend of mine. The only reason Dad's deal, a deal he bragged about for months, was even on the table was because I'd set it up behind the scenes. Quietly. Like always. I sipped my coffee, keeping my voice even. That's rough. Dad hesitated. You don't know anything about this? Well, I said slowly. Seeing as I'm just the family black sheep, I figured you'd rather not have me interfering anymore. He said nothing. I could hear him breathing, short and shallow, the way he always did when he was trying not to lose his temper. Finally, he muttered, All right. We'll figure something out. Good luck, I said, and hung up. I leaned back further, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, relief. For so long, I had been the ghost in the machine. The fixer. The one smoothing wrinkles before they ever appeared. Without me? They were operating blind. And it was only beginning. That night, as the rain drummed against my windows, I got a text from Jenna. Emergency. Call me. I didn't. I let her sweat. The next morning, another flood of messages. Apparently, the mortgage company had contacted Jenna. The payments on her dream house, the one with the wraparound porch and the absurdly large kitchen, were months behind. She had no idea. Of course she didn't. Because I'd been quietly making up the shortfall every month. Ever since her business venture flopped, and she begged me not to tell Mom and Dad. No more safety net. By noon, her house was in pre-foreclosure. I knew, because I'd gotten the same automated emails I used to intercept and quietly delete. One by one, the dominoes started falling. I heard from my cousin, Luke, later that afternoon. He'd been fired. Shocked, blindsided. You told me the VP at Weldon Industries loved me, he cried over the phone. He did, I said calmly. He loved the recommendation letter I wrote for you. Another long silence. You pulled the letter, Luke said finally, like a kid realizing too late that the ice beneath him had always been thin. No, I said. I just stopped pretending you were someone you're not. He sputtered, trying to find words, but I didn't wait for them. I simply ended the call, tossed the phone onto the couch, and smiled to myself. The house was on fire now, and no one had a clue how to put it out. By the third day, it wasn't just cracks in the foundation, it was a full-blown collapse. It started early, just after sunrise. I was sipping my second coffee when my phone buzzed again, this time with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered, half curious. Ethan? This is Tom Caldwell, from Ridgewood Savings. I recognized the name immediately. Dad's banker, the man who had personally vouched for the loan Dad needed to expand his company's operations. I'm afraid there's been a situation, Tom continued, his voice hesitant, like he was trying to deliver bad news to a particularly fragile patient. Some background vetting revealed irregularities. Without a guarantor to reinforce your father's credit, the bank is rescinding the offer. I almost laughed. Guarantor. That had been me, too. A private side deal made years ago, when Dad's business almost folded under mismanagement. I had co-signed quietly, risking my own assets, just so he could keep his head above water. Not anymore. I understand, I said politely, like this was some abstract bit of news and not the sound of a man's life unspooling. Thanks for letting me know. Tom paused. I hate to say this, but he's going to lose a lot if he can't secure new financing. Quickly. I'm sure he'll figure it out, I said and hung up. 5 minutes later, the texts began pouring in. First from my mother, passive-aggressive as always. Your father is under a lot of pressure. Maybe you should check in. Then from Jenna, her tone frantic now, far from the snide, self-assured sister who laughed at me just 3 days earlier. Please, Ethan, can you help? You know people. We're in deep trouble here. And finally from David, the golden child himself. Need to talk. It's serious. No jokes. No smugness. Just 3 short words. I let the messages pile up like autumn leaves at the door. By noon, word had spread through the family like wildfire. My Aunt Margaret, who hadn't so much as liked one of my Facebook posts in 10 years, suddenly remembered I existed. Cousins I hadn't seen since childhood were reaching out, spinning tales of how they always believed in me and valued our bond. I wasn't buying a second of it. The funniest thing was how fast the rot revealed itself. The house Jenna loved? Notices were stapled to her front door before dinner. Foreclosure proceedings were public, neighbors whispering, friends pulling away. Dad's company? Without the loan, suppliers pulled out. Orders were cancelled. Deadlines were missed. His reputation, built on bluster and borrowed credibility, shattered almost overnight. David's job? Gone. Turns out, without my silent recommendations and the strategic networking I used to do behind his back, David was just another loud-mouthed salesman with a mediocre track record. His employer dropped him like a stone. The black sheep had stopped carrying the flock. And the sheep were drowning. I watched it unfold from my quiet, neat little apartment, an island of calm amid their rising storm. I cooked myself dinner. I went for long walks. I slept soundly, the way a man does when the weight he's been shouldering for years finally slides off. Meanwhile, they scrambled. They begged. They flailed. But they would not find a rescuer at the number they once used for jokes and mockery. Not anymore. The confrontation happened sooner than I thought. It was the evening of the 4th day when they showed up, no warning, no invitation. I heard the knock first, rapid, desperate, the sound of fists that had nowhere else left to pound. I didn't rush. I took my time, set down my book, stretched, even fixed the collar of my shirt before answering. When I finally opened the door, there they were. All of them. David in front, his jaw tight, eyes darting nervously. Jenna behind him, cheeks flushed like she'd been crying. My mother clutching her purse like it was a shield. And Dad, stoic, exhausted, his confidence hollowed out like a rotted tree. For a moment, none of them spoke. They just stared at me, seeing, for the first time, maybe ever, that I wasn't the boy they used to push around. That I wasn't the safety net they could abuse and still expect to catch them. David finally cleared his throat. "Hey man," he said, trying to summon that old easy charm, the one that used to smooth over all their mistakes. We need to talk." I leaned casually against the doorframe. "Talk then." They shifted uncomfortably. Mom stepped forward, her voice thin and wobbly. "We didn't mean what we said, Ethan. You know how family is. We joke, sometimes too much." I raised an eyebrow. "A joke? Huh?" Jenna's voice cracked in. "Please. The house. Dad's company, it's all falling apart. We just need—" "What?" I interrupted, my voice quiet but sharp. "You need me to fix it?" They all nodded. Little, desperate motions. I let the silence stretch out until it became unbearable. "You said I wasn't part of this family," I said, my voice low and even. "You said I was the black sheep. That I always would be." David looked away, unable to meet my eyes. Dad, ever the prideful man, stepped forward. "Look, Ethan," he said gruffly. "This isn't the time for grudges. We need to pull together now. Like a real family." I stared at him, feeling nothing but a cool, clean detachment. "You had a real family," I said. "You just never saw it." Mom's face crumpled. Jenna wiped her eyes furiously, furious at herself for crying. David just stood there, hollow. "We were wrong," Jenna said in a rush. "Okay? We know that now. We took you for granted. Please. Help us." I thought about it. I thought about every time I'd bailed them out, quietly, anonymously, only to hear them laugh at me later. Every time I sacrificed my own dreams just to keep their lives stitched together. And I realized something beautiful. I didn't owe them anything. "I'm sorry," I said, smiling slightly. "But if the black sheep isn't good enough for your family dinners, he sure as hell isn't good enough to save your lives." Their faces fell, horror dawning as the door began to close. David reached out, one last desperate grab for the rope they'd frayed and snapped themselves. "Ethan, please," he said, voice cracking. "Without you, we're screwed." The door clicked shut. Softly. Finally. I turned, walking back into my apartment, feeling lighter than I had in years. On the other side of that door, their empire was collapsing. And this time, it wasn't my problem. After the door shut, I stood still for a long moment. Not out of guilt. Not out of doubt. Just absorbing the silence. For the first time, it wasn't heavy or lonely. It was peaceful. Their cries, their apologies, their panic, it wasn't mine to carry anymore. I made a quiet decision, right then and there. I wasn't going back. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when they figured out a new excuse to call it family loyalty. I was done. I wasn't their crutch. I wasn't their fixer. And I sure as hell wasn't their black sheep anymore. I picked up my book again, sat down, and let the weight of years lift off my shoulders. It was strange how easy it was, in the end. Letting go didn't feel like ripping out roots. It felt like walking away from a crumbling house you finally realized you didn't have to rebuild. I didn't need to chase updates. They found me on their own. Word trickled through old friends, through neighbors, even through some distant relatives who hadn't spoken my name in years. Dad's company folded within a month, contracts collapsed, suppliers sued, and by the end of the quarter, he had to sell off assets just to pay his employees. Jenna's house was foreclosed on. She tried to fight it, tried to scramble for a loan, but without my quiet payments, and without my spotless credit tied to hers anymore, the bank didn't even blink. David bounced from job to job. None of them stuck. Every time a potential employer checked his references, the truth caught up with him. Without my silent hand pushing him forward, there was nothing impressive left. Even Mom, who used to float through life on a cloud of denial, started calling mutual friends, asking if they'd heard from me, if I'd maybe reconsider. I heard it all, sitting comfortably in my apartment, watching their empire rot from the edges inward. No rage. No glee. Just peace. They were finally living in the world they had built without me. And I had no intention of going back to help them rebuild it. It didn't take long for their pride to crack. When all their frantic scrambling failed, when the business accounts dried up, when the foreclosure became public record, when David had to move back into a tiny rental he could barely afford, then they came crawling. It started with letters. Actual, handwritten letters, as if that somehow made the words more meaningful, more sincere. The first one arrived tucked under my door, the shaky handwriting unmistakably my mother's. "Dear Ethan," it began. "We made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. We took you for granted. We didn't see how much you did for us until it was too late. Your father is not well, Jenna is desperate, David is lost. We need you. Please come home." I set it aside without finishing it. Then came the gifts. Packages stacked outside my door, homemade pies, framed family photos, even an old baseball glove from when I was 10, the one Dad refused to replace even when it fell apart. As if they thought nostalgia could buy forgiveness. And finally, when none of that worked, they showed up again. Not with anger this time. Not with fake laughter or jabs disguised as jokes. No, this time, they came like beggars. I remember the knock. Softer. Almost timid. When I opened the door, it wasn't the same proud, smug family I'd known. It was a broken collection of people, standing there like survivors of a shipwreck. David spoke first. He looked thinner. His eyes sunken. "We're sorry," he said simply. No smirk. No sarcasm. Just raw desperation. Jenna stepped forward next, clutching her purse like it could anchor her to something stable. I can't fix this without you," she said, voice trembling. "Please, Ethan. You always knew what to do." Even Mom, who had once laughed behind my back, had tears in her eyes now. "I didn't know how much we lean on you," she whispered. "We thought you'd always be there." There it was, their confession, finally spoken aloud. Not just that they needed me now, but that they had always needed me. They just never had the humility to admit it. For a long moment, I said nothing. I just let them squirm in the silence, let the weight of years and years of their arrogance settle heavy on their own shoulders for once. And then I said, very quietly, very clearly, "You told me I was the black sheep." They looked away. "You told me I didn't belong," I continued. "That I would never be enough for this family." David opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. "No. You don't get to rewrite history now. You laughed when you thought I was weak. You only cry now because you're the ones who've fallen." Jenna wiped at her face, but she didn't argue. None of them did. "And you know what?" I said, stepping back into my apartment, one hand on the door. "You were right." They blinked at me. "I don't belong," I said simply. "Not with people who only value what I can give them. Not anymore." And then I closed the door. Softly. Without drama. Without another word. I didn't even lock it, there was no need. They wouldn't be coming back. And even if they did, I wouldn't be opening the door again. When the door clicked shut behind me, it felt like the closing of a chapter one hadn't realized I'd been trapped in for most of my life. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I didn't feel the invisible chains around my neck, the constant, aching pull to fix everything, to earn approval that was never truly offered. I walked back to my living room. Sat down. Looked around. Everything here was mine. Every book on the shelf, every photograph on the wall, every late night and early morning spent building a life for myself. Not for them. I thought maybe I'd feel guilty. That some old part of me, the little boy who once longed for his father's praise, who tried to buy his family's love with good deeds, would claw up from the dark and tell me to go back. But no voice came. Just silence. And in that silence was peace. Over the next few weeks, life became lighter. No calls demanding favors. No frantic texts needing money. No guilt-tripping letters pretending love. I went for long walks. Took trips I'd postponed for years. I bought things for myself without hearing that nagging voice about wasting money. I even started painting again, something I hadn't touched since college, when Mom said it was a waste of time. My world grew while theirs crumbled quietly in the background. I heard through the grapevine that Dad had sold his truck and moved into a smaller place. That Jenna had taken a low-paying job just to make ends meet. That David had been seen working night shifts at a warehouse outside of town. And through it all, they still didn't rebuild themselves. Because they had never learned how. They had spent a lifetime depending on someone they mocked. And now, the black sheep they thought so little of was the one living free. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was simply the truth catching up to them. Freedom has a strange flavor. It's not as sweet as I thought it would be. Not loud or triumphant like the movies make it seem. It's quiet. Like breathing clean air after a lifetime in a smoke-filled room. In the weeks that followed, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. I never needed them. Not their approval. Not their laughter. Not their grudging acceptance. I had built a life, a real one, not because of them, but in spite of them. Looking back, I could see it so clearly now. All the times I stayed up late figuring out how to cover Jenna's overdue bills. All the endless calls and networking I did to make sure David got second and third chances he didn't deserve. All the subtle nudges, the backdoor fixes, the quiet sacrifices to make sure Mom and Dad never had to face the consequences of their own bad decisions. And every time I caught them when they stumbled, they laughed harder. Every time I saved them, they loved me less for it. I learned something else, too. When you carry people for too long, they don't thank you when you put them down. They curse you. They call you selfish. They demand you come back and shoulder the weight again. Because it's easier to blame the one who walked away than it is to admit they never learned how to stand on their own. I thought for a long time that if I just did enough, if I worked harder, smiled bigger, forgave quicker, they would finally see me. Finally love me the way I had seen and loved them. But some people don't see you. Not really. Not ever. To them, you're just what you provide. And the second you stop providing, you vanish. I wish I could say it didn't hurt. That cutting them off was like snapping dead branches off a tree. But the truth is, even dead branches are hard to break sometimes. Even when you know it's what you need to survive. Still, as the days stretched into weeks, the hurt faded. And what grew in its place was something stronger, deeper. Pride. Peace. A future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I found myself again, not the black sheep they laughed at, but the man who had carried the whole flock without even realizing it. And now, standing alone? I was finally standing taller than I ever had before.